The Shape of Things to Come by H.G. Wells. Part 9. The Direct Action of the Armament Industries in Maintaining War Stresses. We must now say something about the direct activities of the hypertrophied armament firms in bringing about and sustaining the massacres of the Great War. A proper understanding of that influence is essential if the stresses and martyrdoms of the middle years of the 20th century are to be understood. These armament firms were an outcome of the iron and steel industry, which in a few score years between 1700 and 1850 grew up, no man objecting, from a modest activity of artisans to relatively gigantic possibilities of production. This industry covered the world with a network of railways and produced iron and then steel steamships to drive the wooden sailing ships off the seas. And at an early stage, all this is traced in full detail in Luc Zimmermann's Entwicklung und Geschichte von Kruppismus, or Development and History of Kruppismus, 1913, historical document 394112. It turned its attention to the weapons in the world. In a perpetual progress, in the size and range of great guns, in a vast expansion of battleships that were continually scrapped in favor of larger and more elaborate models, it found a most important and inexhaustible field of profit. The governments of the world were taken unawares, and in a little while the industry, by sound and accepted methods of salesmanship, were able to impose its novelties upon those ancient institutions with their tradition of implacable mutual antagonism. It was realized very soon that any decay of patriotism and loyalty would be inimical to this great system of profits, and the selling branch of the industry either bought directly or contrived to control most of the great newspapers of the time, and exercised a watchful vigilance on the teaching of belligerents in schools. Following the established rules and usages for a marketing industrialism, and with little thought of any consequences but profits, the directors of these huge concerns built up the new warfare that found its first exposition in the Great War of 1914 to 1918, and gave its last desperate and frightful convulsions in the Polish Wars of 1940 and the subsequent decades. Even at its outset in 1914 to 1918, this new warfare was extraordinarily uncongenial to humanity. It did not even satisfy man's normal combative instincts. What an angry man wants to do is to beat and bash another living being, not to be shot at from 10 miles distance or poisoned in a hole. Instead of drinking delight of battle with their peers, men tasted all the indiscriminating terror of an earthquake. The war literature stored at Atacama, to which we have already referred, is full of futile protest against the horror and unsportsmanlike quality, the casual filthiness and indecency, the mechanical disregard of human dignity of the new tactics. But such protest itself was necessarily futile, because it did not go on to a clear indictment of the forces that were making, sustaining, and distorting war. The child hallowed and wept, and they did not even attempt to see what it was had tormented it. To us nowadays, it seems insane that profit-making individuals and companies should have been allowed to manufacture weapons and sell the apparatus of murder to all comers. But to the man of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it seemed the most natural thing in the world. It had grown up in an entirely logical and necessary way, without any restraint upon the normal marketing methods of peacetime commerce, from the continually more extensive application of new industrial products to warfare. Even after the World War catastrophe, after the complete demonstration of the futility of war, men still allowed themselves to be herded like sheep into the barracks, to be trained to consume and be consumed by new lines of slaughter goods produced and marketed by the still active armament traders, and the accumulation of a still greater and still more dangerous mass of war material continued. There is a queer little pseudo-scientific essay by a Bengali satirist, Professor K. Chandra Sen, 1897 to 1942, among the Indian series of reprints, professing to be a study of the relative stupidity of the more intelligent animals up to and including man. He is concerned by the fatuity with which the mass of humanity watched the preparation of its own destruction during this period. He considers the fate of various species of penguins, which were then being swept out of the world. The 20th century was an age of extermination of hundreds of species, and infers a similar destiny for mankind. He begins with the slaughter of the penguins. He gives photographs of these extraordinary creatures in their multitudes, gathered on the beaches of oceanic islands and watching the advance of their slayers. One sees them scattered over a long sloping shore, standing still, or waddling about, or flapping their stumpy wings while the massacre goes on. They seem to be vaguely interested in the killing of their fellows, but in no way stirred either to flight or resistance. No thorough scientific observations, we may note, were ever made of penguin mentality. The revival of experimental psychology comes too late for that, and we are left now to guess what went on in these queer brains of theirs during these raids. There is evidence to show that these creatures had curiosity, kindliness, sympathy, and humor, and they were eminently teachable. They stood quite high in the scale of bird intelligence, and yet they permitted their own extinction. They were not so much amental, Professor Sin insists, half seriously, half mockingly, as defective and wrong. They were capable of many idea systems, but not of the idea of social preservation. He suggests, too, that the same was true of the sea elephants, which were also very rapidly destroyed. The last of these were murdered later to make a record by a Japanese lunatic with a craving for an immortal name when the protective patrol was withdrawn during the revolt of the sea pirates in Christian era 1985. But after Professor Sin has weighed every possible case, he still awards the palm for complacent social stupidity to man. With a fine parody of the social research methods of that time, he gives various photographs of what he calls the human penguins of that early 20th century, waddling in their sleek thousands to see battleships launched, to rejoice over reviews and parades, to watch their army aeroplanes stunting in the sky. Side by side, he gives photographs of penguin assemblies that, either by happy accident or skillful rearrangement, are absurdly parallel. He gives lists of shareholders in the armament firms, including the current Bishop of Erfurt, the current President of the Free Church Council, a great multitude of clergymen, artists, judges, and every sort of gentlefolk. He quotes extensively from the Hansard records and various debates in the British House of Commons. In a debate on the naval estimates early in 1914, Philip Snowden, the radical socialist who afterwards became Viscount Snowden, was particularly explicit, showing that the nature of the danger was clearly seen and clearly and publicly stated, only it was not felt. It is upon that little difference between factual apprehension and the kind of apprehension that leads to effective action that our interest concentrates here. Why did humanity gape at the guns and do nothing? And why, after the Great War, after that generation had seen over 20 million human beings perish painfully and ultimately, did it still go on, doing nothing adequate to the occasion? With the preparations still mounting up and the horrible possibilities of war increasing under its eyes, the great cradle of Bethlehem Steel Corporation of America in 1929 was revealed as actively opposing naval disarmament at the Geneva Conference of 1927. At any rate, it was associated with 3 shipbuilding companies who were sued by a Mr. Shearer, who claimed to have been given the task for fees alleged to be due to him. There seems to have been little dispute that he had been so employed. The case turned upon the extent of his services and the amount of his fees. Nothing was done by the penguins either to the companies concerned or to Mr. Shearer. A few expressed indignation, that was all. Just as now and then, no doubt, a bird or so squawked at the oil hunters. For a detailed account and references, see The Navy Defense or Portent by C. A. Beard, 1930, reprinted historical document series, 4,270,112. The clue lies in the fact that there was practically no philosophical education at all in the world, no intelligent criticism of generalizations and general ideas. There was no science of social processes at all. People were not trained to remark the correlations of things. For the most part, they were not aware that there was any correlation between things. They imagined this side of life might change and that remain unaltered. The industrialists and financiers built up these monstrous armaments and imposed them on the governments of the time, with a disregard of consequences that seems now absolutely imbecile. Most of these armament propagandists were admirable in their private lives, gentle lovers, excellent husbands, fond of children and animals, good fellows, courteous to inferiors, and so on. Sir Basil Zaharoff, the greatest of munition salesmen, as one sees him in the painting ascribed to Orban, recently discovered in Paris, with his three-cornered hat, his neat little mustache and beardlet, and the ribbon of some order of chivalry about his neck, looks quite a nice, if faintly absurd, little gentleman. Those shareholding bishops and clergy may, for anything we know to the contrary, have had charming personalities, but they wanted their dividends. And in order to pay them those dividends, the dread of war and the need of war had to be kept alive in the public mind. That was done most conveniently through the press. You could buy a big newspaper in those days, lock, stock, and barrel, for $5 or $10 million, and the profits made on one single battleship came to more than that. Naturally, and according to the best business traditions, the newspapers hired or sold themselves to the war salesman. What was wrong in that? Telling the news in those days was a trade, not a public duty. A daily paper that had dealt faithfully with this accumulating danger would quite as naturally and necessarily have found its distribution impeded, have found itself vigorously outdone by more richly endowed competitors, able, because of their wealth, to buy up all the most attractive features, able to outdo it in every way with the common reader. It wasn't that the newspaper owners and the munitions dealers wanted anyone hurt. They only wanted to sell equipment and see it used up. Nor was it that the newspapers desired the wholesale mangling and butchering of human beings. They wanted sales and advertisements. The butchery was quite, by the way, an unfortunate side issue to legitimate business. Short-sightedness is not diabolical, even if it produces diabolical results. And even those soldiers. Freudheim, in his analysis of the soldiery mind, shows a picture of that Sir Henry Wilson, we have already mentioned, arrayed in his shirt sleeves and digging modestly in the garden of his villa during a phase of retirement, and the same individual smirking in all his glory, buttons, straps, and decorations, as a director of military operations. It is an amazing leap from the suburban insignificance of a retired clerk to godlike importance. In peacetime, on the evidence of his own diaries, this Wilson was a tiresome nobody, an opinionated bore. In war, he passed beyond criticism and became a god. One understands at once what a vital matter employment and promotion must have been to him. But so far as we can tell, he desired no killing as killing. If he had been given blood to drink, he would probably have been sick, yet he lived upon tanks of blood. These professional soldiers thought of slaughter as little as possible. It is preposterous to say they desired it, much less that they gloated over it. It might have fared better with their men if they had thought of it more. They had an age-old sentimental devotion to their country, a solemn sense of great personal worth in their services, an orgiastic delight of battle, and they did not see, nor want to see, what was beyond their occupation. Their religious teachers were quite ready to assure them they were correct in all they did and were. The sentient Christian churches of that age had indeed a very direct interest in war. A marked tendency to ignore or ridicule the current religious observances had become manifest, but under the stresses of loss and death, people turned again to the altar. It is easily traceable in the fiction of the time. The despised curiate of teacups and croquet lawn became the implicitly heroic padre of the sentimental war stories. The problem that confronted the growing minority, that was waking up to the perils and possibilities of our species in the third and fourth decades of the 20th century was this: how, in the first place, to concentrate the minds of people onto this state of distraction and diffusion, and how to bring them to bear upon the crude realities before them. And then, how to organize the gigantic effort needed to shake off that intermittent and even more dangerous fever of war, and that chronic onset of pauperization which threatened the whole world with social dissolution. There was no central antagonist, no ruling devil for the anxious spirits to fight. That would have made it a straight, understandable campaign. But the press, with a certain flavoring of pious intentions, was practically against them. Old social and political traditions, whatever the poses they assumed, were tacitly against them. History was against them, for it could but witness that war had always gone on since its records began. Not only the current Bishop of Hereford and the current President of the Free Church Council caught with their dividends upon them, but their churches and the Catholic Church, and indeed all the Christian churches, in spite of their allegiance to the Prince of Peace, were quietly competitive with, or antagonistic to, the secular world controls that alone could make a healthy world peace possible. The admission of the insufficiency of their own creeds to comfort or direct would have been the necessary prelude to a new moral effort. And the idea of the naturalness and inevitability of war was not only everywhere in the world around those few forward-looking men who knew better, it was in their blood and habits. They were seeking how to attack, not a fortress, but what seemed a perpetually recuperative jungle of mixed motives, tangled interests, and cross purposes within themselves as without.